welcome. So I was thinking about space the other day, as one does, and I realized that I'd never made a spaceship before, so I set out to rectify that. First, I started out by doing a rough sketch of what I had in mind. I particularly wanted something long and sleek, but still industrial looking. After that, I could draw out precise plans and start my cutting. And I began with the hull, as its shape informed the rest of the build. I cut and scored lines to resemble panels. Then some hand cramps later, I had window frames which I could attach to the inside of the hull. Once I was done, everything felt too narrow, so I added a spacer to broaden out the hull. Then I created the main launch tunnel with holes for future lights. Once all the main pieces were done, I went through and placed PVA glue into the seams, which prevents them from soaking up paint and expanding. Next I created some bay doors to go inside the side launch tunnels. And after doing a grey primer spray on everything, I could start the detail painting, starting with a sponging of light grey just to give a tiny bit of texture to the model. Then I lightly sanded that down and started doing individual colours for the different panels. I added metallic silver to the paint and mixed in blacks and blues to get the colours I needed. And once I was done, I did a pure black for all the window frames. And then I did a black wash for all the seams and tiled off the excess. I masked off some graphics for the ship and painted those orange just to give some vibrancy to the build. I got some bleeding under my masking tape, but that was fine because I could just go back and do some touch-ups. Then I went in with the heavy dry brush to highlight edges and create uniformity across the panels. I had saved the cutouts from the windows of the hull, so I used those as a template to draw around to create the actual windows to go into it. Then I could attach the templates to a sheet of plastic and cut them out. After those were glued in place, I decided to black out some of the windows for some variation, and then I did a blue wash to get a hue to the windows. I then used yellow for additional accents of hazards and signage. After that, I could begin gluing the main launch tunnel together. At this stage, I wasn't happy with the front face, so I made a new one to replace that. Then I began final assembly. Wherever I had gaps, I used PVA glue and toilet paper to fill them. After that, I worked in the rear section, which I stepped in from the sides. I focused here on getting all the panel lines to neatly align. Then came one of the bigger challenges of this build. I found the string of LED lights that I thought could work, but after stringing out the first side, I realized there was way too much wire to fit inside the hull. So I cut all the individual bulbs off of the string, and I rewired them into a much neater configuration. And I added some more lights across the top and along the sides. I also placed foil on the top of the hull just to make the most of the lights. And everything test fitted okay. I could then turn my focus to the bottom of the ship, for which I created a spinal-like column. In addition to the spinal column, I added a spacer, a small front platform, and a masthead, which I joined together with some piping. And then I went around and added some extra details. After that, everything got a gloss varnish, and then I can move on to constructing the jump gate. In order to create a circular mold for a resin pour, I used corrugated plastic, which I split into two. The closest thing I could find to the size I needed was a water spray bottle, so I wrapped the plastic around that before applying Gorilla Glue, which will expand when activated by water and fill the gaps in between the outer and inner ring. I then siliconed the circle down to a plate of acrylic. After checking for level, I could begin my first pour. I did multiple shallow pours of epoxy resin to build up the gate. On each pour, I introduced white acrylic paint, which I blended to create a wispy, ethereal look within the portal. Once that had set, I could remove the silicone and pop it off of the acrylic. Then, with no struggle whatsoever, I could take off the outside trim. Then I designed and plotted out the jump gate itself. And then I could give the gate dimension by sandwiching a vertical piece of board between the two circles. Then for the detailing that would surround the portal, I cut some shapes from board and lightly crimped them to create a concave shape. Then I glued an arch onto that structure to help it retain its shape. I filled the gaps at the edges with clay and then sanded that down once it had dried. This worked fairly well, but did become brittle over time. Then after I added some more details, I could move on to the lighting. For this, I used an LED strip which I could run around the inside of the gate. And then it was disco time. Then after recuperating, I added some more details. Cotton wool is really good at diffusing light, so I added that inside the circle and then blended it out into the portal itself. And lastly, I drilled a hole through the center through which you can feed the wires from the ship. I found these boards, which are a great size to build the base and the back of the diorama. After drilling pilot holes through the boards for screws, I could give it a sanding and then a coat of gloss black. I covered the back board in Mod Podge and then sprinkled crushed glass on it to represent stars. Then I could attach the base to the back plate and cut a small hole through which I could feed the plug for the LEDs. I could then attach the jump gate itself to the base, and I added several supports around it to elevate it off the background and base. I could then feed all the wiring through and glue the ship to the jump gate. Inside the rear cavity of the back, I inserted the sensor for the LED strip and added switches to control the lights on the ship. After popping in some batteries, I gave it a test and then I could close up the ship. And the last thing was to attach the upper hull. And I couldn't resist doing it, so I made a whole bunch of tiny little fighters just to add to the scene. And that was that.